Everyone gives credit to one car for changing the shape of the family hatchback forever. You already know its name. But 9 years before that car ever touched a showroom floor, there was another one, a French one, and it did almost everything first. This is the story of the Simca 1100, a car built by a company most people have forgotten, a car that outsold nearly everything in its class for over a decade, and a car that somehow got written out of the history books. Stick with me, because by the end of this, you're going to look at every hatchback on the road today a little differently. Let's go back to the early 1960s. Simca was a serious French automaker, riding high on the success of a small rear-engined car called the Simca 1000. But in 1963, everything changed. Chrysler, the American giant, took a controlling stake in Simca, and with American money came American ambition. Internally, the next project had a code name, Project 928. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't secret, in some cinematic sense. But it carried enormous pressure, because Simca's engineers were told to build something that would sit right between their small city car and their bigger family saloon, a gap in the lineup, a gap in the market. And Chrysler wanted it filled fast. The target was summer of 1967. That's barely 3 years from approval to production. Anyone who has worked in an engineering department knows what that kind of timeline does to a team. Long nights, compressed testing, decisions made under pressure that either become genius or catastrophe. There was no room for a slow, comfortable rollout. This had to work the first time. There was also a very French reason behind all this urgency, and it had nothing to do with styling or engineering. It was about tax law. Cars in France were classified by fiscal horsepower, and the gap Simca needed to fill sat squarely inside the desirable 6 CV tax bracket, right between the tiny Simca 1000 and the bigger, pricier Simca 1300. Land in that sweet spot, and ordinary working families could actually afford to register and run the car. Miss it, and the whole project risked being dead on arrival before a single unit ever left the factory floor. And here's the part that should stop you in your tracks. While most manufacturers in that price class were still building simple 3-box saloons with a trunk bolted onto the back, Simca's engineers were quietly designing something radically different. Front-wheel drive, a wide-opening rear hatch, a rear seat that folded flat. This wasn't a facelift of an old idea. This was a completely different way of thinking about what a family car could be. Nobody outside the factory walls knew it yet. But that pressure cooker deadline was about to produce one of the most underrated cars of the 20th century. In May of 1967, the curtain came up. First shown on the island of Sardinia, then properly unveiled to the world at the Paris Motor Show that same year, the Simca 1100 didn't just enter the market. It rewrote the rulebook for what a mid-size family car was supposed to be. Pay attention to this, because it matters. Front-wheel drive, disc brakes on the front axle, rack and pinion steering, independent suspension all around, using torsion bars front and rear. A hatchback body with a rear seat that folded down flat, turning a 5-seat family car into a small cargo hauler in seconds. Now, none of those features were unheard of individually, somewhere in the automotive world. But nobody, and I mean almost nobody, was putting all of them into one affordable, mainstream family car at the same time. That's the part that gets lost in the retelling. Compare it honestly to what else existed at that moment. The Renault 16 was bigger, a class above. The Austin Maxi belonged in that same higher tier. The only real contemporary rival, a car that shared a similar philosophy, was the Auto Bianchi Primula out of Italy. Everyone else was still building conventional saloons with a trunk lid instead of a real hatch. That's what made the 1100 dangerous to its competition. It wasn't chasing an existing formula. It was writing a new one, in a segment that hadn't figured out yet that this was even possible. The engine itself wasn't some exotic new design. It was a larger, reworked version of the unit already used in the smaller Simca 1000, bored out to just over 1100 cubic centimeters. In its early form, it produced somewhere between 53 and 56 horsepower, depending on the trim level. modest numbers by today's standards. But paired with a car this light, this practical, and this well-engineered underneath, it didn't need to be a rocket. It needed to be smart, and it was. Buyers noticed almost immediately. This wasn't a slow-burn success story. It was fast. Here's another detail worth sitting with. Under the hood, Simca arranged the engine and gearbox side by side, transverse to the direction of travel, with the transmission bolted on the end rather than tucked underneath. At the time, that layout was almost unheard of outside of Fiat. Today, walk into any dealership on Earth and look under the hood of almost any small front-wheel drive car, and you'll find that exact same arrangement, engine on one side, gearbox on the other. It became the default layout for the entire industry, and it was quietly proven out, years ahead of the mainstream, on a French family car most people can't even picture in their heads. Now, if you're watching this, and you're old enough to remember showroom floors from the late 60s and early 70s, this next part might hit close to home. The right-hand drive version of the Simca 1100 launched in Britain at the London Motor Show in October of 1967, just months after its French debut. And here's the detail almost nobody remembers anymore. It was sold in Chrysler and Roots dealerships, sitting on the same showroom floor as the Hillman Imp, the Hillman Avenger, and the Hillman Hunter. Think about that for a second. A French-engineered, front-wheel drive hatchback, parked wheel-to-wheel with classic British saloons, under the same corporate roof. For a certain generation, that's not a history lesson. That's a memory. Maybe your father had one. Maybe your neighbor did. Maybe you test drove one yourself and didn't think twice about how far ahead of its time it actually was. And this is exactly the kind of channel where we dig into stories like this. The cars that shaped an entire era but somehow slipped through the cracks of popular memory. If that's the kind of content you want more of, this is the moment to hit subscribe, so you don't miss what's coming next. And down in the comments, I want to know, do you remember seeing a Simca 1100 back in the day? Drop it below, hit like if this is bringing back memories, and share it with a friend who was around back then too. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling these stories. Now back to the numbers, because they're staggering. Over its full production run, the Simca 1100 sold more than 2 million units. 2 million. Across 15 years on the market, it became one of the best-selling cars in France, at one point becoming the single most popular new car sold in the entire country in a given year during the 1970s. This wasn't a niche success. This wasn't a cult classic, beloved by a handful of enthusiasts. This was, for a stretch of years, one of the most common cars on French roads. A genuine mainstream phenomenon. And Simca didn't just sit still after launch. By 1969, barely 2 years in, the lineup had already grown. A 3-door hatchback joined the original 5-door. A proper estate wagon arrived for buyers who needed even more room. Trim levels multiplied too, from the basic LS, up through Good Luck and GLS, each one adding a little more comfort and a little more polish. Simca kept refining this car year after year, rather than letting it stagnate, and the discipline is a big part of why it stayed relevant for as long as it did. But the story doesn't stop there, because in 1974, Simca did something that most people, even serious car enthusiasts, still don't give it credit for. In the United States, this story takes a turn you probably weren't expecting. Starting in the late 1960s, Chrysler brought this very same car across the Atlantic, but under a different badge, not the 1100. Here, it wore the name Simca 1204, sold through Chrysler, Plymouth and Dodge dealerships around the country. For one brief moment, it actually worked. In 1969, American dealers moved more than 7,000 of them, but then the numbers started sliding fast. By 1970, sales had dropped to just over 6,000. By 1971, only around 2,600 were sold, and Chrysler pulled the plug entirely. Here's the part that should genuinely frustrate you. The American road testers, who actually got behind the wheel, came away impressed. They praised how solid the structure felt, how quiet and rattle-free the cabin was, and how far ahead of the competition it seemed to be engineered. More than one review at the time wondered out loud why Chrysler wasn't pushing this car harder. Chrysler didn't listen. Instead of investing in the 1204, the company replaced it in American showrooms with the Plymouth Cricket, a rebadged British Hillman Avenger that was, by nearly every account, a far rougher, less refined machine. The Cricket flopped almost immediately. And here's the twist that makes this genuinely painful to look back on. Right around that same window, Volkswagen was preparing to bring a small, front-wheel drive hatchback of its own to American roads. You know it as the Rabbit. In Europe, it wore the name Golf. The engineering formula was almost identical to the Simca, front-wheel drive, transverse engine. A practical, folding-seat hatchback body. The Rabbit became a massive success in America. The car it resembled most closely had already come, gone, and been quietly buried by its own manufacturer, years before Volkswagen ever got there. Here's the detail that changes the entire conversation. In 1974, Simca introduced a hotter, more focused version of the 1100, badged the T. A tuned engine, sharper, handling. A more aggressive character wrapped inside that same practical hatchback body. Now, ask most people, even people who genuinely love cars, which vehicle invented the hot hatch. The answer you'll get, almost every single time, is the Volkswagen Golf GTI. And the Golf GTI is a phenomenal car, nobody's arguing that. But the Golf GTI launched in 1976. The Simca 1100 Ti beat it to market by 2 full years. Let that sink in for a moment. The car widely credited with inventing an entire category of automobile, the hot hatch, the fun, affordable, practical performance car that millions of enthusiasts still chase today, wasn't actually first. A French car most people have never heard of got there before it, and somehow, when car magazines write the history of the hot hatch, that fact rarely makes the page. This is the part of the story that should genuinely frustrate you a little, if you care about giving credit where it's due. Because the Simca 1100 wasn't a fluke, and it wasn't a footnote. It was consistently ahead of the curve, first to combine front-wheel drive and a proper hatchback in its class. Among the first to offer a genuinely sporting hot hatch variant, a bestseller for over a decade. And yet, ask someone on the street to name a groundbreaking hatchback from history, and you'll hear Golf, you'll hear Mini, you might even hear the Renault 5. You will almost never hear Simca. So why did a car this important, this successful, this genuinely pioneering, end up almost completely forgotten? The answer isn't about the car. The car was never the problem. The answer is about what happened to the company behind it, and that part of the story is a lot less comfortable. But before we get there, one more piece of evidence. That same year, 1974, Simca gave the whole range a proper update. Rectangular headlights replaced the original round ones, up front. The dashboard was redesigned for a cleaner, more modern layout. And under the skin, engine options kept expanding too, growing over the years, from the original 944 and 1118 cubic centimeter units, all the way up to a 1204 and eventually a 1300. This wasn't a car that launched strong and then coasted on its reputation. Simca kept pushing it forward, year after year, right up until the end. There's one more chapter to this story that almost nobody brings up, and it might surprise even the gearheads watching this. Simca didn't just build the 1100 as a sensible family car and call it a day. There was a more serious, competition-bred version too, badged the 1100S. And it wasn't built just to look sporty parked outside a cafe. It actually went rallying, on the biggest stage there was. Behind the wheel of a works-prepared 1100S, driver Bernard Fiorentino took the car to the Monte Carlo Rally, one of the toughest and most prestigious events in all of motorsport. And he didn't just show up to make up the numbers. He gave the mighty Alpine Renault team, the dominant force in French rallying at the time, a genuine run for their money. Picture that for a second. A humble, front-wheel drive family hatchback, The same basic car your neighbor might have used to drive the kids to school on a Tuesday morning, going wheel to wheel on closed mountain roads against purpose-built racing machines from one of the most feared teams in the sport. That's not a footnote. That's a genuinely wild fact that most people, even die-hard car enthusiasts, have simply never heard. It's one more example of just how far ahead of its reputation this car actually was. Underneath that practical, unassuming shape was a chassis good enough to go toe-to-toe with genuine racing royalty on some of the most demanding roads in Europe. This is where it gets heavy. Because the fall of the Simca 1100 isn't really about the car at all. It's about corporate collapse and about how quickly a legacy can be erased when the money runs out. Chrysler's European operations, including Simca, struggled financially through the middle and later part of the 1970s. Rising costs, increased competition. A company stretched too thin across too many markets, without the investment needed to keep innovating the way it had in 1967. By 1978, Chrysler had seen enough. It sold its entire European operation, Simca included, to the French manufacturer PSA, the parent company of Peugeot and Citroën. And here's the moment that changed everything for this car's place in history. PSA didn't want two competing French brand identities under one roof. So, piece by piece, the Simca name was phased out. Vehicles that would have once worn the Simca badge started appearing under a different name entirely, Talbot. A brand that had been dormant for years, suddenly resurrected to replace the very identity that had built the 1100 into a 2 million unit success story. Think about the cruelty of that timing. A car that had spent over a decade proving itself in showrooms across Europe, a car that had genuinely pioneered the modern hatchback formula, was now watching its own name disappear from the vehicles built in its image. The next generation of Simca-derived cars simply weren't called Simcas anymore. Production of the passenger version of the 1100 finally ended in 1982. The commercial van variants held on a little longer, soldiering through until 1985. And then, quietly, without fanfare, without a farewell tour, one of the most influential family cars of its era simply stopped being built. No documentary crews showed up, no retrospective magazine covers. The car that had beaten the industry to the punch on front-wheel drive hatchback practicality, and beaten it again on the hot hatch formula, just faded out of production and, not long after, faded out of memory too. That's the real tragedy here. It was never about whether the Simca 1100 was good enough. It was always good enough. It was about who survived long enough to keep telling the story afterward. And Simca, as a name, didn't. And here's one final twist, almost too ironic to believe. The platform underneath the 1100 didn't just disappear. It evolved into the Talbot Horizon, which crossed the Atlantic a second time, wearing the badges Dodge Omni and Plymouth Horizon. This time, in America, it actually sold in serious numbers. The very engineering the United States had rejected the first time around finally found its audience there, years later, under yet another name, long after the Simca badge that started it all was already gone for good. So here's what I want you to take away from all of this. Being first doesn't guarantee you get remembered. That's an uncomfortable truth, and it applies far beyond the automotive world. The Simca 1100 did almost everything right. It read the market before its competitors did. It engineered a genuinely better solution to a real, everyday problem. It sold in numbers most manufacturers only dream about. And it still got buried, not by a better car, but by boardroom decisions made years after it had already proven itself. If you drove one back in the day, if your family had one parked in the driveway, sometime between the late 60s and the early 80s, you were driving a piece of automotive history that most people around you probably never fully appreciated. And honestly, maybe you didn't either, at the time. Nobody stops to think about engineering history while they're just trying to get the kids to school. But now you know. Now, next time someone brings up the car that supposedly invented the modern hatchback, or the hot hatch, you've got the real story. And that's worth something. One more thing worth mentioning before we wrap up. The underlying mechanicals of the 1100 didn't just power hatchbacks and wagons. They also became the foundation for the Matra Rancho, a rugged-looking, go-anywhere little vehicle built in the late 1970s that looked, for all the world, like a proper four-wheel drive off-roader. It wasn't. Underneath that tough bodywork sat the same humble front-wheel drive platform from the 1100. Decades before every manufacturer on Earth started building crossover SUVs dressed up to look tougher than they really are. This quiet little French family car had already written that playbook too. If this brought back a memory, or if you just learned something that surprised you, do me a favor. Hit subscribe, so this channel can keep bringing you the real stories behind the cars that shaped an entire generation. The ones history tends to skip over. Drop a comment and tell me what part of this stuck with you the most, whether it's the TI beating the Golf GTI to market, or the way the Simca name disappeared after 1978. Hit like if you enjoyed this, and if you know somebody who'd appreciate this story, a friend, a father, anybody who remembers cars like this one, send it their way. There are more stories like this one coming, cars that deserved better than what history gave them. I'll see you in the next one.